There's something that happened after I left my marriage that nobody ever warned me about. It wasn't the loneliness, it wasn't the money, it wasn't learning how to be alone. It wasn't even starting over, after 51. It was something that happened inside my own head. My memory started lying to me. I know that sounds strange, but hear me out. After you've lived through something difficult, your mind has a funny way of rewriting the story. You stop remembering everything. Instead, you remember pieces. The vacations, the family pictures, the Christmas mornings, the moments somebody smiled at you, the times that things felt normal. And little by little, the really bad days start fading, into the background. Somehow they get pushed to the back furthest corners of your mind. And I know that because it happened to me. There were days after I left, living in my truck, trying to figure out what my life was even going to look like. You know, when I'd find myself thinking maybe it really wasn't that bad. And every single time that thought crossed my mind, I had to stop myself because it wasn't the truth. It was my memory editing the movie. The truth wasn't one bad argument. It wasn't one terrible day. It wasn't one big event. It was thousands. Thousands of little moments of, walking on eggshells, never knowing what version of somebody I was coming home to. Losing my confidence one small piece at a time, second guessing myself, keeping my mouth shut just to avoid another fight. You know, and feeling anxious in your own home, feeling relief every time they weren't there. That's not something that happened once. That happened over years. But your memory doesn't replay years. It replays highlights. And it's funny because nobody looks through an old photo album and sees arguments. They don't see the silence. They don't see sleeping on opposite sides of the bed. They don't see sitting in another room because it's easier than talking. They don't see the stress that had my blood pressure through the roof, the acid reflux, the anxiety, the depression. The doctor's telling me over and over again, stress is doing this. Back then I didn't even believe them. Today, I'm off every one of those medications. And that wasn't a coincidence. That was my body finally telling me that the truth my mind had been trying to ignore. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why so many people go back. Not because the relationship suddenly becomes healthy, because it never does. And not because enough time passes that the pain gets blurry. The good memories stay sharp and the bad memories fade away. Oh, you know, our minds have a way of protecting us from pain. Unfortunately, sometimes they also protect us from the lessons pain was trying to teach us. I caught myself doing it more than once. I remember things like us going on vacations or, us going camping. I'd remember holidays. I'd remember sitting around laughing. I'd remember the good moments. And just for a second, I'd wonder if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And then I'd stop myself. Not because I hated her, not because there weren't good memories. There absolutely were. Every relationship has good memories. That's why leaving is so hard. You know, if every day was miserable, nobody would stay. The good moments are real, but they aren't the whole story. You know, one thing that I've learned while rebuilding my life is that peace has an incredible way of exposing the truth. Just a few days ago, I took my 10-year-old son camping. Just the two of us and my old bulldog Bruno. We cooked over a wood fire. We went fishing. We built a hobo stove. We did a little bushcrafting. We swam. We sat around the fire talking. And I've done a video on that. But one evening, I sat there watching the sunset over the lake, and I realized something. I don't think I've ever experienced peace like that in my entire adult life. And it's not because I'd never gone camping before. I had. And not because I'd never laughed before. I had. The difference was I wasn't managing the chaos anymore. Nobody expected me to become somebody I wasn't. Nobody was angry. Nobody was controlling the atmosphere. It was just peace. That moment reminded me very clearly why I left. Not because I remembered the bad, but because I finally experienced the good. Real good. Looking back, I don't regret my marriage. It gave me my children. It taught me lessons that, you know, I probably never would have learned any other way. But I also won't allow my memory to rewrite history. Because rewriting history has a way of convincing people to walk back into places they fought so hard to escape. There's a huge difference between forgiveness and forgetting why you had to leave. I've forgiven a lot. I'm still working on some of it. But forgiveness doesn't require me to pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't require me to erase the truth. Sometimes people ask me if I'd ever go back. The answer isn't based on anger, and it's based on peace. Because now I know what peace feels like. And once you've experienced real peace, it's almost impossible to convince yourself that constant chaos was normal. If you're rebuilding your life, whether it's after a divorce or losing someone, losing a career, or simply just becoming a different person, be careful because your memory is going to tell you stories, and some of them will be true, some of them won't. But just remember the highlights. Remember the reason that you started rebuilding in the first place. Don't lose sight of that because that reason matters. It mattered enough to change your life. So don't let time convince you that it never happened. Y'all, I'll see you in the next one.